It was a normal school day, or so it seemed. But for Jasmine, the day was about to take an unexpected turn. As she walked through the school's crowded hallways, her mind was focused on the math test she had just aced and the lunch she had been looking forward to all morning. Yet, as she rounded the corner, a group of students stood blocking her path. Jasmine tried to step around them, but one of the boys, someone she recognized from gym class, stepped forward with a smirk. "Where are you rushing off to, girl?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Jasmine hesitated. She didn't want trouble, she just wanted to get to lunch. But this wasn't the first time she had encountered this boy's teasing. What made it worse was the laughter that followed from the others around him, as if they had rehearsed this moment, waiting for the right time to strike. His friends stood by, silently encouraging him with their stares. She stood tall, determined not to let them see her flinch. But the boy wasn't done. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "What, you think you're better than us just because your dad's a cop?" he sneered. Jasmine felt a sting in her chest. It was true. Her dad was a police captain, but it didn't make her special. Why do they have to bring that up? Why do they have to bring him into this? Unbeknownst to Jasmine, the boy wasn't just any regular student. He was the son of a firefighter who, despite his respected job, carried his own set of prejudices and grudges. It wasn't just an innocent tease, it was a calculated jab, a way to use her father's profession against her. And what he didn't know was that Jasmine's father, the captain of the local police, was more than just a man in uniform. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the taunts grew louder, Jasmine's mind raced. Should she just walk away and let it slide, or should she speak up? Should she confront him now, or wait until later? Her heart pounded, knowing that this situation could easily escalate beyond a few hurtful words. And the moment that seemed to stretch on forever finally came to a head when she turned to walk away and heard one of the boys shout after her. "Bet your daddy couldn't save you from me if I told him what you did." Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks. What had she done? What was he going to say? It felt like everything was spiraling out of control. Her father had always warned her to be strong, to handle these situations with grace, but how could she handle this? How could she stand up for herself when they were using her father against her? She wanted to say something back, to defend herself, but she felt paralyzed. The walls of the school hallway seemed to close in on her. What Jasmine didn't know was that the situation would have far more consequences than just words being exchanged. Her father's name carried weight in their town, and when he found out what happened, things would never be the same again. The boy's father, a respected firefighter, had no idea the trouble he was stirring. The lives of these two families were about to collide in a way that no one could have anticipated. A chain of events had been set in motion, and the consequences would soon be far-reaching. One incident, one misunderstanding, would threaten to change everything. The tension was building, and Jasmine didn't know what to do next. As the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, she found herself walking out to the parking lot with a feeling of unease growing inside her. The story was far from over. In fact, this was just the beginning. The question wasn't whether Jasmine would stand up for herself. The real question was, how far would this escalate? Would her father ever find out what had happened, and how would he react? And just as Jasmine stepped into the car, something unexpected happened, a call from her dad. The moment she picked up the phone, she could feel her heart race. "Jasmine, I need you to listen carefully." Her dad's voice sounded serious, tense even, and Jasmine knew that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. Would she be ready for the storm that was coming? The truth was, she had no idea. Jasmine's hand tightened around the phone, her heart racing in her chest. The weight of her father's words hung in the air, thick with a sense of urgency she hadn't expected. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, her thoughts spinning. What was happening? Why was her dad so serious? He was always the calm, composed figure, the one who handled crises with a steady hand. But right now, his voice was tense, an unfamiliar edge that made her nervous. Jasmine, I need you to listen carefully, he repeated, his tone softening slightly but still firm. There's been an issue at school today. Some things have come to my attention, and I need you to be honest with me. Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to tell him everything. What had happened with the boy in the hallway, the teasing, the way they'd singled her out. But she knew that wouldn't be enough. There was something else her dad wasn't telling her. She could hear it in the way his voice trembled ever so slightly, like he was holding something back, something bigger than just a few taunts. "What's going on, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father paused. She could almost hear him taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I don't know all the details yet, but it seems your classmate, Jake Dawson, has been making some serious accusations about you. They're serious enough that I need to get involved. His father, the firefighter, has already called me." Jasmine's stomach dropped. Jake Dawson, the same boy who'd been taunting her in the hallway. She couldn't understand why he would be involved with her father, let alone why his father had called him. The Dawsons were a well-known family in their town. Her father had worked alongside them many times over the years, but that didn't explain what was happening now. "Accusations," Jasmine repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What kind of accusations?" "Jake is claiming that you've been making threats against him, using your father's position to intimidate him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "He says you've been bragging about your dad being a cop, using that to get people to back off." Jasmine felt a wave of confusion wash over her. This didn't make sense. She hadn't said anything like that. She barely even mentioned her dad at school, let alone used his job to get people to leave her alone. The idea of her being accused of something like that felt wrong, and yet, here she was, stuck in the middle of something she didn't understand. "Dad, I swear I didn't do that," she said, her voice trembling. "I've never said anything like that. You know I would never use you like that." "I know, sweetheart," her father replied, his voice softening. "I trust you. But right now, I need you to stay calm. There's a lot going on, and I need you to be careful. I don't want you to get caught up in something that could spiral out of control." Jasmine's mind was racing. She had no idea why Jake would say something like that, especially when she had barely ever even spoken to him. She wasn't the type to start drama, and she certainly wasn't the type to lie about her dad's job to make herself look tough. But the accusation had been made, and her father was taking it seriously. That meant it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something deeper going on here, something that involved more than just words. "I don't understand," Jasmine muttered, still reeling from the shock of the conversation. "Why would he say something like that?" Her dad sighed, a long, heavy exhale. "I don't know, Jasmine. But I have to find out. You have to be honest with me. Did you say anything at all? Did you get into a fight with him or anyone else today?" "No, Dad. I haven't done anything," Jasmine replied quickly, the frustration building inside her. "It's not like that. He was just messing with me." Her dad paused again, and Jasmine could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. She knew he wasn't just a police captain. He was a man who saw through people. He could tell when something didn't add up, and right now, everything about this situation felt wrong. The pieces weren't fitting together. "All right," he said finally. "I'll handle it from here. But you need to lay low, understand? Don't get involved any more than you already have. I'll be looking into it." Jasmine hung up the phone, her hands still shaking. What was going on? What was Jake's game? And why was his father, someone her dad had worked with for years, getting involved in this mess? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jasmine barely noticed the passing time or the people around her. Her mind was occupied with the conversation she'd just had with her dad, with the accusations that Jake had made, and with the mystery surrounding the whole situation. As she walked home after school, the weight of it all seemed to press down harder on her. What could she do to make it right? How could she prove her innocence when everything seemed to be working against her? She knew one thing for sure: the Dawsons were no strangers to power and influence in their town. They were respected figures, and Jake's father was no different. A firefighter, strong, brave, a man who commanded respect from everyone around him. But Jasmine also knew her father wasn't someone you could push around. He had earned his own respect, and he wasn't going to back down without finding out the truth. As Jasmine walked into her house, the familiar scent of her mother's cooking filled the air, a small comfort in the midst of everything. She dropped her bag by the door and collapsed. "Jasmine, we need to talk," he said, his tone low and controlled. "I've had a conversation with Jake's father, and it seems there's more to this than I realized." Her heart skipped a beat. What was happening now? What had her dad uncovered? Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as her father closed the door behind him and sat down next to her. The way his posture stiffened, the seriousness in his eyes, she knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Her dad had been involved in enough tense situations over the years to know when something was brewing beneath the surface, and whatever was happening now, it was far bigger than just a misunderstanding between her and Jake Dawson. "I spoke to Jake's dad," her father began, his voice calm, but with an underlying tension that made Jasmine's stomach twist. "His name's Mark Dawson, and he's been with the department for over 15 years. You've seen him around, right? You know how respected he is." Jasmine nodded absently. She had seen Mark Dawson plenty of times at school events, at community fundraisers, always smiling and shaking hands. He was a fixture in their town, someone everyone trusted, the kind of person who seemed to be above reproach. "Mark told me that Jake's been saying some troubling things," her dad continued, pausing as if choosing his next words carefully. "He's claiming that you threatened him, that you said something about how your dad could make his life miserable because you have connections in the police department." Jasmine's mind reeled. Asterisk no, asterisk, she had never said anything like that. Not once. The words didn't even make sense coming from her. She hated when people made her father's job part of her identity, and she would never use it like that. She could feel her frustration bubble into the surface, but she kept her voice steady, trying not to sound defensive. "Dad, I swear I never said anything like that to him. Why would I? I don't even talk to him." Her father gave her a long, searching look. His eyes softened for a moment before he spoke again. "I believe you, Jasmine, but something isn't adding up here. There's more going on with Jake than I thought." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She could feel her pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What's going on with Jake?" Her father's gaze darkened slightly. "Mark Dawson doesn't want to admit it, but there's a history between him and your grandfather. You know how your grandfather and I have always had a strained relationship, right?" Jasmine nodded slowly. Her grandfather had been a police officer too, before retiring. She knew the history was complicated. Her dad had always kept things quiet, not wanting to drag her into it. But now it seemed like that history was coming back to haunt them. "Jake's father is tied to some old grudges," her dad continued. "I don't think it's just about you. I think he's using you as a way to get at me. And I'm willing to bet he's not the only one who feels this way." Jasmine's mind raced. Was this really about her father? Had Jake been caught up in some sort of generational feud that had nothing to do with her? She had felt like she was the one being targeted, but now the picture was becoming clearer. She wasn't just caught in the middle of high school drama. She was tangled in something much bigger. "I don't understand," Jasmine whispered, shaking her head. "Why would he involve me in this? What's the point?" Her father stood up, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair in a rare display of agitation. "That's the problem, Jasmine. I don't have all the answers yet, but I've been around long enough to know when people are playing games, and I can tell you one thing for sure, this isn't just about you." Jasmine felt a knot form in her stomach. Was her father in danger? Was this feud, whatever it was, going to get worse? She couldn't help but feel that the situation was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her father stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression more somber than she had ever seen it. "I need you to be careful, Jasmine. If there's one thing I know for sure, it's that this town can be full of secrets. I'm not sure if Jake's involved in something bigger, or if his dad is just using him, but I'm going to find out. I won't let this ruin our family, and I won't let anyone use you as a pawn." Jasmine nodded slowly, but inside, she felt the weight of her father's words pressing down on her. There was something about Jake's accusations that didn't sit right with her, something that made her feel like she was being watched, like someone was waiting for her to slip up. The next day at school, Jasmine tried to keep her head down. She told herself that if she stayed out of the way, kept to herself, maybe things would blow over. But as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that eyes were following her every move. She tried to ignore it. At lunch, she sat with her friends, but it wasn't the same. The usual chatter felt forced, awkward. Jasmine could see the glances passing between them, the way they would quickly look away whenever she caught their eye. She knew something was wrong. They were avoiding her, whispering behind her back. She couldn't blame them. How could she explain what was happening when she didn't understand it herself? Just as she took a bite of her sandwich, her phone buzzed on the table. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was a message from her dad. "Jasmine, you need to get out of there. Now." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? What had her father discovered? She quickly gathered her things, trying to stay calm, but the anxiety was beginning to build again. What was it this time? Was Jake involved in something even darker than her father had suspected? She didn't have time to think. Her father's warning was enough to send her heart into overdrive. As she walked quickly toward the exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe more than one person, was waiting for her, watching her every move. The hallway seemed longer than usual, as if the space between each step stretched out before her. She had to get out, but she didn't know where to turn next. All she knew was that the storm was coming, and she had no idea how to prepare for it. Jasmine's heart raced as she made her way through the crowded school hallways. The warning from her father echoed in her mind like a constant drumbeat. Asterisk, get out of there. Now. Asterisk. But where could she go? She hadn't fully processed what was happening. The more she tried to make sense of it, the less it seemed like she could. Jake's accusations, her father's involvement, the tension between the Dawsons and her family, it was all becoming too much. She rounded the corner by the lockers, the buzz of student conversations blending into a dull hum in her ears. But then she saw him. Jake Dawson. He was standing with a group of his friends, leaning against the lockers like he owned the space. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something cold and unsettling passed between them. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look that made her skin crawl. For a second, she thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just stared, his gaze almost calculating. Jasmine quickened her pace, trying to keep her composure, but it was hard to shake the feeling that Jake knew more than he was letting on. He knew something was happening, something big, and he was part of it. As she passed by, she heard a voice, low and clipped, just loud enough for her to catch the words. "Your dad's gonna regret this." The words hung in the air, long after she had moved past. Jasmine froze, a cold chill creeping up her spine. Was that a threat? Her mind raced, her instincts telling her to keep going, to ignore it, but she couldn't. This wasn't just a fight between kids anymore. It was bigger, something darker was at play, and she was smack in the middle of it. Her father had warned her, but now she was realizing just how dangerous the situation had become. As she reached the parking lot, she noticed her father's car parked at the edge, just as she'd expected. She was almost there, but just before she could reach the door, she felt a hand on her shoulder. The sudden touch made her jump. She spun around, heart in her throat, only to see a familiar face. It was Mark Dawson, Jake's father. His presence was enough to stop her dead in her tracks. She hadn't expected him to be here, not today. He was usually the calm, collected figure she had seen at various events, a friendly face in the community, but now he looked different. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, his eyes, dark and cold, fixed on her as if sizing her up. "Jasmine," he said, his voice smooth, but laced with something she couldn't quite identify. "We need to talk." Her heart raced. She didn't know what he wanted or why he was speaking to her, but she knew it couldn't be good. Her father had warned her about getting involved, but now here was Jake's father, blocking her path, and for a moment, all the breath seemed to leave her body. "I don't have anything to say to you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but her hands were shaking. "I don't know why you're here, but I'm not interested in talking." Mark Dawson's lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The warmth he had always shown in public had disappeared. There was something darker in his gaze, something predatory, and Jasmine felt every muscle in her body tense up. "Oh, but I think you do," he said, taking a step closer, closing the gap between them. "You see, your father has been asking a lot of questions, too many questions, in fact. People are starting to talk, and it's only a matter of time before everything comes to light." Jasmine took a step back, but Mark didn't seem to notice. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I don't know what you want from me." Mark's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "I think you do, Jasmine. You see, the Dawsons and the law enforcement, they've never seen eye to eye. Your father's been too eager to climb the ranks, and people don't forget. Your family thinks they're untouchable, but no one is." He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Not even your precious father." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She felt the world spin around her. Was this why Jake had accused her of threatening him? Was it all part of a bigger plan? And what was this about her father climbing the ranks? She had no idea what Mark Dawson was implying, but the way he spoke made it clear that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be easy to stop. Before she could respond, a voice broke through the tension. "Jasmine, get in the car." She turned, relief flooding her when she saw her father standing by the car, his face set with determination. Mark Dawson's eyes flicked to him, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. It was like a silent war was waging between them, one that Jasmine didn't fully understand. Mark took a step back, his smile returning, but it was no longer friendly. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "We'll see who's really untouchable." Her father didn't respond. He simply stepped toward her, his presence commanding her attention. Without saying another word, he opened the car door, urging her to get in. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, the weight of Mark's words still hanging in the air. What was going to happen next? She didn't know if she was ready for whatever was coming, but she knew one thing for sure: it was about to get much worse. As she climbed into the car, her father slammed the door shut behind her and quickly got in the driver's side. Without a word, he started the engine, and they pulled out of the school parking lot, the tension between them thick and uncomfortable. Jasmine's mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. What had just happened? And what was Mark Dawson really trying to say? Her father's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The silence between them felt heavier than ever, as if both of them were holding something back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her father spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not done yet, Jasmine. This is just the beginning. But I promise you, no matter what happens next, we'll face it together." Jasmine didn't know whether to feel reassured or terrified, but one thing was certain: this was only the calm before the storm. The real battle was still ahead. The drive home was a blur of tight silence and heavy thoughts. Jasmine's mind was racing, each second stretched thin with the weight of her father's words. "We'll face it together." But how? How could they face something she still didn't fully understand? Her father had always been the steady one, the protector, the man who could handle anything. But now she wasn't so sure. Mark Dawson's cryptic warning still echoed in her mind, and with every mile they drove away from the school, the sense of danger seemed to grow stronger, like an invisible storm gathering on the horizon. As they turned onto their street, Jasmine noticed something strange. The front porch light was on. It wasn't unusual, except the car parked in the driveway caught her eye. Another police car, parked just slightly askew. Her father had stopped driving, But the moment he saw the car, his jaw tightened. Without a word, he pulled the car up, parked quickly, and turned off the engine. Jasmine's chest tightened. Something was wrong. Her father was already halfway to the door by the time she stepped out of the car, her legs stiff as she followed him inside. The door was unlocked. As they stepped into the living room, her father's tense movements spoke volumes. His eyes darted around, scanning the room, as if he were expecting something to jump out at him. Jasmine's pulse quickened. And then she saw it. On the kitchen table, an envelope, bright white, almost too clean against the worn wood of the table. Her father didn't even need to open it. He recognized the handwriting, the familiar scrawl that belonged to an old colleague. A colleague from long ago. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low and controlled, but Jasmine could hear the tremor in it. "Stay in the living room. Don't come in here." She nodded, but she couldn't stay away. Not when she felt that something was shifting in the air, something too big to ignore. She stood by the doorframe, barely breathing, as her father opened the envelope. His face drained of color as he read whatever was written inside. Jasmine wanted to rush over, to demand answers, but she stood frozen, waiting for him to speak. The silence was suffocating, the only sound the soft rustling of paper. Her father swallowed hard and turned his back to her, pressing his hands to his temples like he was trying to hold himself together. "I can't explain it right now. Just go upstairs, please." Jasmine's mind was racing. She couldn't just leave. Not when something had clearly just been set into motion. Her father hadn't acted like this in years. And when she stepped into the living room, she felt it. Someone was watching them. A soft knock at the front door made her jump. She had been so lost in the confusion, she hadn't even noticed the sound. Her father was already moving toward the door before she could react, his face blank, but his movements quick, deliberate. He opened it without hesitation, and a man in a dark suit stood there, a grim expression on his face. "Captain Harris?" the man asked, his voice cold. "I'm afraid we need to talk." Jasmine felt the air in the room thicken as her father's shoulders tensed. The man at the door didn't wait for a response. He stepped inside, brushing past her father without a word. She could see the insignia on his suit, a symbol she recognized instantly. It wasn't local law enforcement. It was higher up, much higher. This was someone from outside the county, someone with power, someone who meant business. "Who are you?" Jasmine asked before she could stop herself, her voice shaking. The man turned toward her, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jasmine Harris. I'm afraid this doesn't concern you." Her father shot a warning glance at the man, but the stranger wasn't fazed. He continued, "We've been keeping an eye on things, Captain Harris, and it looks like your daughter's involvement in this matter is more than just a coincidence." Jasmine's heart sank. What was he talking about? She looked at her father, but he was already turning away, walking toward the man with a stiff expression. He hadn't said a word to her. No reassurance, no explanation, just silence. "Do you have proof?" Her father's voice finally broke the silence, steady but laced with something Jasmine couldn't place. The man nodded, pulling something from his jacket, a small black device. He held it out for her father to see. Jasmine's eyes widened in disbelief. It was a recording device, and the screen on it flickered to life, showing a grainy video of a conversation. "Listen to this," the man said, pressing play. Jasmine's stomach twisted as the voices from the recording filled the room. The words were distorted, hard to make out at first, but the more it played, the clearer it became. "We have to get to Jasmine Harris and fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Her father needs to fall. Jasmine's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Jake Dawson's father, Mark. He was talking about her. Talking about her father. But why ? What did he mean by fall? Her father's face went pale as the video ended, and the room seemed to grow colder. The man in the suit didn't give him a chance to process. This is bigger than you think, Captain Harris. There are people involved that you haven't even begun to suspect. You've been on the radar for too long, and we need your help to clean up the mess before it spirals out of control. You're either with us, or you're against us. The air was thick with tension as her father clenched his jaw. For the first time, Jasmine saw doubt in his eyes, something she had never thought she'd witness. He was caught in something far deeper than she could have imagined, and now it seemed there was no way out. "I'll need time to think," her father said, his voice strained. The man in the suit gave a sharp nod. "Time is something we don't have. You have 24 hours. After that, the consequences won't just affect you, Captain. They'll affect your daughter too." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She felt a coldness spread through her body, a feeling of helplessness like she had never known. 24 hours. She had no idea what that meant, but the fear in her father's eyes told her everything she needed to know. Time was running out. As the man turned to leave, Jasmine's father grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the door. The stranger was gone before she could ask more questions. But as her father closed the door behind them, his voice was barely a whisper. "We're running out of time, Jasmine, and I don't know how we're going to fix this." Jasmine sat in her room, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She could hear her father pacing downstairs, his muffled voice barely audible as he made one call after another. The cryptic warning from the man in the suit still rang in her ears. 24 hours. The words felt like a ticking clock in her head, counting down to something she couldn't fully grasp. Her father was always in control, but tonight she'd seen cracks in his armor, and it terrified her. She stared out the window, the street outside eerily quiet. "Time's up. Check your front porch." Her hands shook as she read the words over and over. She wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't real, but curiosity and fear pulled her to the window. She peered out, her breath catching in her throat when she saw a figure standing at the edge of their driveway. The man didn't move, his silhouette blending with the shadows. He was just standing there waiting. She bolted from her room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. "Dad," she called, panic creeping into her voice. Her father met her at the base of the stairs, his phone still in his hand, his face pale. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "There's someone outside," she said, pointing toward the front door. "And I got this message." She handed him her phone, and his face darkened as he read the text. "Stay here," he said firmly, already moving toward the door. But Jasmine couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. When he opened the door, the man stepped forward, his face finally visible under the porch light. It was Mark Dawson. "I figured it was time we had a talk," Mark said, his tone casual, but his eyes glinted with something dangerous. "No intermediaries, just you and me." Her father stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between Jasmine and Mark. "If you've come to threaten my family, you've made a mistake," he said, his voice steady, but Jasmine could see the tension in his posture. Mark laughed, the sound sharp and cold. "Oh, this isn't a threat, Captain. It's a warning. You've been digging into things you shouldn't. You're putting yourself and your daughter in danger." Her father didn't flinch. "And what exactly am I supposed to have found? Mark, enlighten me." Mark's smile faded, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. "You know what this is about. My family, my reputation, everything you've been poking your nose into. You think you can just expose the past without consequences." Before her father could respond, the sound of tires screeching on the pavement made them all turn. A black SUV sped down the street, stopping abruptly in front of the house. The doors flew open, and 3 men in dark suits stepped out, their movements quick and coordinated. One of them spoke into a radio, his words clipped and precise. "Secure the perimeter." Jasmine's father turned to her, his voice urgent. "Get inside. Now." But Jasmine couldn't move. The scene unfolding in front of her was surreal, like something out of a movie. The men approached the porch, and the leader addressed her father. "Captain Harris, we need you to come with us. It's imperative we contain this situation before it escalates." Her father stood his ground. "I'm not going anywhere until I know my daughter is safe." The man's expression didn't waver. "Your safety, and hers, depends on your cooperation. We've been tracking Dawson for years. You stumbled onto something far bigger than you realize." Jasmine's eyes darted between her father and Mark, trying to piece together the puzzle. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What are they talking about?" Her father hesitated, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Jasmine, there are things I've kept from you to protect you. Things about this town, about the Dawsons, and about my work. But now, there's no hiding it anymore." Mark scoffed, crossing his arms. "Go ahead, Harris. Tell her the truth. Tell her how you've been building your career on secrets and lies, just like everyone else in this town." Her father ignored him, turning to Jasmine with a pained expression. "Years ago, I uncovered evidence of corruption tied to the Dawsons. They've been using their influence to manipulate the system, police, judges, even politicians. I thought I could take them down quietly, but it's bigger than I ever imagined. And now, they're trying to silence me." Jasmine's mind reeled. She had always seen her father as a hero, someone who stood for justice. But now, she was learning he had been fighting a shadow war, one that had put them both in danger. Before she could respond, one of the men in suits stepped forward, holding up a tablet. "Captain, we intercepted a communication from Dawson. He's planning to leave town tonight. If we don't act now, we lose our chance to stop him." Her father nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then let's finish this." Jasmine grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "You can't just go after him. It's too dangerous." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with determination. "I have to, Jasmine. This ends tonight." As he turned to leave with the agents, Jasmine noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a small, blinking red light on the edge of the porch. It wasn't there before. Her stomach dropped as she realized what it was. "Dad, wait," she shouted, but it was too late. The explosion was deafening, the force throwing her back into the house. The world blurred into chaos, shattered glass, splintered wood, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. When she opened her eyes, the porch was gone, reduced to smoldering debris. Her father was nowhere in sight. Tears streamed down her face as she stumbled outside, calling his name. One of the agents pulled her back, shouting something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. As the smoke cleared, she saw a figure emerging from the wreckage, her father, alive but bloodied, dragging Mark Dawson with him. Mark's face was pale, his confident demeanor shattered. "It's over," her father said, his voice rough but unyielding. "You're not running away from this." But as the agents moved to take Mark into custody, he gave one last chilling smile. "You may have won this round, Harris, but the game isn't over." Jasmine's father stood tall, his resolve unbroken. "We'll see about that." As they watched the agents drive away with Mark in custody, Jasmine knew their lives would never be the same. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt hope. Her father had faced the darkness, and together, they would be ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the explosion were a blur of sirens, questions, and the quiet hum of relief that Mark Dawson was finally in custody. Jasmine sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her father was being treated for minor burns and a broken rib, but the doctors assured her he would make a full recovery. The sight of him walking out of the wreckage had been both a miracle and a testament to his resilience, but she couldn't shake the image of the explosion or the sound of his name echoing through the chaos. It would take time to forget, if she ever could. The agents had been relentless in their questioning, piecing together a narrative Jasmine could barely comprehend. Mark Dawson had been orchestrating a network of corruption for years, using fear and leverage to maintain his power. Her father's investigations had brought him dangerously close to uncovering it all, and Mark's desperation had finally led to his undoing. The planted bomb was meant to silence her father once and for all, but it had only added more evidence to the growing case against him. Jasmine's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. A text from her dad. Asterisk room 212. Bring some decent coffee, please. Asterisk, she let out a small laugh, the kind that comes after days of tension finally start to release. Grabbing her bag, she stopped at the hospital cafe to get him his requested drink before heading to his room. When she walked in, her father was sitting up in bed, looking tired but more himself than he had in days. His arm was in a sling, and a bandage peeked out from under his hospital gown, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Ah, the hero returns," he said with a smirk, reaching for the coffee she held out. "Hero, I think you've got the wrong person," she replied, settling into the chair by his bedside. "You're the one who dragged Mark Dawson out of a literal explosion." He took a sip of the coffee and made a face. "Still better than hospital coffee. And you're wrong, Jasmine. If it weren't for you, I might not have seen what was really at stake. You reminded me why I started this fight in the first place." Jasmine felt her throat tighten. "I didn't do much. I just tried not to lose my mind while everything was falling apart." Her father reached over, placing his good hand over hers. "You did more than you know. And you were brave, even when things got terrifying. That matters." She nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the world seemed to slow down. The constant tension and fear had eased, leaving space for something else, hope. Later that evening, they were discharged from a hospital under the watchful eyes of the agents who had become a familiar presence in their lives. The men in suits were no longer faceless strangers. They were allies, determined to see justice done. As they helped Jasmine's father into the car, one of them handed her a folder. "Captain Harris will need to review this when he's feeling better," the agent said. "It's everything we've uncovered so far. Mark Dawson's network runs deep, but we've made significant progress thanks to your father's work. This isn't just a win for your family, it's a win for this entire community." Jasmine nodded, clutching the folder tightly. The weight of it felt symbolic, like a closing chapter and the beginning of something new all at once. The drive home was quiet, her father leaning back in his seat, eyes closed but not asleep. Jasmine glanced at him, wondering how he managed to carry so much responsibility and still stay standing. She knew he wasn't invincible, but in that moment, he felt like the strongest person she'd ever known. When they pulled into the driveway, the sight of their house was both comforting and strange. The porch had been rebuilt in record time, but the scars of the explosion lingered in small ways, a patch of singed grass, a lingering smell of smoke in the air. As they walked inside, Jasmine was struck by how normal everything looked. The dishes were still in the sink, her schoolbooks still on the kitchen table. Life hadn't paused, even when theirs had been turned upside down. Her father sank into the couch with a groan, and Jasmine sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt heavy but necessary, a space to process everything they'd been through. Finally, her father broke the silence. "You know, I used to think I could handle everything on my own, that I had to. But this reminded me that it's okay to lean on people, even my stubborn, fearless daughter." Jasmine laughed softly. "I'm not fearless, Dad, not even close." "You when it mattered," he said, looking at her with a seriousness that made her chest tighten. "And that's what counts." Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. Jasmine went back to school, though the looks from her classmates reminded her that the story of what had happened had spread far and wide. Jake Dawson had transferred to another school, and she couldn't say she missed him. The reminders of his father's cruelty were still too fresh. Her father worked closely with the agents, providing testimony and helping untangle the web of corruption that Mark Dawson had built. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all seemed too much. But they had each other, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat on the newly rebuilt porch, Jasmine turned to her father. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, the question that had been on her mind since the day of the explosion. He took a deep breath, staring out at the darkening sky. "I think it's as over as it can be. People like Mark Dawson don't just vanish, but his power is gone. And as long as we stay vigilant, as long as we don't let fear stop us, we'll be okay." Jasmine nodded, his words settling in her chest like a warm ember. She knew there would always be shadows, always be challenges, but she also knew they had faced something extraordinary and come out stronger for it. As the stars began to dot the sky, she leaned against her father, a quiet peace settling over them. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt like something to look forward to. The end wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.